On this edition of Punctuation Primer, we're going to talk about colons and semicolons. People often confuse colons and semicolons. However, the two pieces of punctuation serve very different purposes. And it looks like our good friend Mario has a question about that. What is the difference? Well, let's take a look at each and understand the rules so we can tell how to use both of them effectively and clearly in our writing. Let's start with colons. And they actually serve four different purposes. So what are these uses? Well, first, colons can introduce lists. They can also introduce conclusions, summations, and appositives, which are simply a renaming of something. But let's take a look at examples of each of these so we can understand the subtle nuanced differences between each of them. Now, before we begin, let's consider an important note. A colon must be preceded by an independent clause, also known as a complete sentence. That means that when you use the colon, whatever element comes before the colon should operate as a complete sentence if you simply close it out with a period. But this can be a little complicated, so let's first take a look at how that rule applies correctly and incorrectly with regard to lists. Mario has fought, and now we're going to list the people that Mario has fought. So a lot of people here will use a colon, and then they'll introduce their list. Donkey Kong, Bowser, and Wario. However, in this context, this is actually wrong. Sorry, Mario, I'm sure you got a couple more lives left. So let's understand why this is wrong. If we simply close that first element out with a period, Mario has fought, that does not operate as a sentence. It's not an independent clause. Therefore, in this context, we're only going to bring in the list without the colon because that serves as an object. Mario has fought Donkey Kong, Bowser, and Wario. No colon. But I'm sure you want to understand how you could reframe this sentence so that you can use a colon to introduce a list. So let's take a look at how that would function. All right, let's start the sentence a different way. Mario has fought several villains. All right, so if we put a period here, that actually works as an independent clause. So good job there. Mario has earned his life back. Now, let's replace that period with a colon and then introduce that list of villains, Donkey Kong, Bowser, and Wario. And now we can use that colon to introduce the list because we have a complete sentence before the colon. Now, in addition to lists, colons can also introduce conclusions. Okay, let's see how this conclusion works here. Based on the trail of bananas, it was clear who had kidnapped Princess Peach. Now, in this context, we have a complete sentence again, and it's driving to our main point, which is the person who kidnapped Princess Peach. We have a conclusion, so we introduce a colon, and you'll see here that colon can now be used to introduce our conclusion, which is Donkey Kong. Of course, Donkey Kong kidnapped Princess Peach. Now, it looks like Mario's got to have a little trouble getting out of here, so let's give him a hand. And there he goes. Colons can also be used to introduce summaries. So let's take a look at how colons function in this context. Looks like Mario has showed up late for the house party. So we have a long clause here. After Bowser's party, the house was filled with overturned turtles, sorry Yoshi, mushrooms, and fire. Don't stay away from that fire, Mario. Now, in this context, we have a long clause, but there's a key point we want the reader to see in this long clause. So we use a colon and then introduce a summary. It was a mess. It was a mess is a complete sentence that summarizes the key points you want the reader to see in that long passage. And we can use this because it is an effective way to emphatically drive home your key point after a long clause. Now, you could also invert this, and that will help you highlight your main point before a long passage, especially a long block quote. And by doing that, you actually ensure that your audience reads a long passage through the lens that you want them to. So they will identify any themes or trends that you want them to see in that passage. Now, it looks like our good friend Mario is in a little bit of trouble here, so let's give him a hand and help him get to the next stage. And finally, we can use colons for appositives. So let's see how that works. Well, it looks like Mario's got a question here. What is an appositive? Well, that's actually a pretty good question. Let's sort that out. An appositive is simply a renaming or rephrasing of a term or name. Now let's take a look and see how that works in practice in our next example. Well, it looks like Toad's got a message. Thank you, Mario. You have saved the Mushroom Kingdom's princess region. Now, the princess region is a specific princess. She is next in line to the throne in order of succession within the monarchy's hierarchy. But lots of times there's more than one princess, yeah? And the reader might not be clear on which one you're referring to. So here's a good place to use a colon and then introduce an appositive to specify Princess Peach. And in this case, Princess Peach is the princess region. They are one and the same person, and you provide that clarity by renaming the initial object. Now, there's lots of analogous situations. Maybe you're in business. The person most responsible for the company's success was the CEO, Bill Gates, and Bill Gates is the CEO. Or the player who is most responsible for the team's success was the MVP, Stephen Curry, right? Now, we've gone through the different uses of the colon, but there are some subtle, nuanced rules we want to understand, particularly about capitalization. So let's take a look at those. Oh, Mario's got another question. Should we capitalize after a colon? I think our good friend Toad has an answer. If there's a proper name or independent clause after the colon, then the first word should be capitalized. Otherwise, you will use lowercase. But let's take a look at a couple of examples so you can see how this rule applies in practice. After Bowser's party, the house was filled with overturned turtles, shrooms, and fire. It was a mess. Now here we have it was a mess. That operates as a complete sentence. Therefore, we're going to capitalize the first word. Alternately, we might say that Bowser is dangerous for three key reasons: his fangs, horns, and razor-sharp claws. In this context, the list does not comprise or constitute an independent clause. We simply have an itemized list of nouns. There's no verbs, no objects. Therefore, we're going to use lowercase. Now, in this context, then, for colons, we will capitalize only if there's an independent clause or a proper name. Otherwise, we're going to use lowercase. And with that, it's time to talk about semicolons. Now, semicolons actually serve two different purposes. First, they can be used to link independent clauses and separate complex items in a list. So let's take a look and see how the semicolon functions in those two respects. We'll begin with linking clauses. All right, so Pac-Man likes cherries and Miss Pac-Man likes apples. So we have two simple sentences here, but how can we link them together? Well, because we have two independent clauses, two complete sentences, and because they are equally important, and also because they share a clear relationship with each other, rather than simply having a period and full stop, we could instead change that first period to a semicolon. And now we'll have a compound sentence in which the reader can see the two sentences are related to each other. Now, caution, use semicolons when appropriate. The question though here, as our good friend Pac-Man asks, is when is it appropriate to use a semicolon? Well, there's two instances, broadly speaking: parallel sentence structure, and that refers to sentences that you're comparing and contrasting and that share a parallel structure, and also sentences relatively short that have an obvious relationship with each other. Let's begin with the parallelism. We have Pac-Man likes cherries, Miss Pac-Man likes apples. Pac-Man starts the first clause, Miss Pac-Man starts the second, and the reader can immediately see that the subjects are similar. Then that's reinforced with the verb. Both sentences use the word likes as the primary verb. And finally, each of the clauses close out with a fruit. We got cherries and then apples. And when the reader sees the parallel sentence structure and the semicolon linking them together, they can see and identify and understand your emphasis here is to compare and contrast what Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man respectively like. Now, keep in mind, even with longer sentences, as long as they're parallel in structure, the reader can still see these kinds of relationships when you link the two clauses together with a semicolon. Let's take a look at instances where the reader can easily make an inference as to what the relationship is. Here we have Mrs. Pac-Man wears heels, semicolon, she likes to feel tall. Now the reader knows that heels are worn to make somebody taller, and then we have the reference to being tall in the second clause. Therefore, the reader can infer that there's a cause and effect relationship between the two. If that cause and effect relationship or any other logical relationship is not overtly clear to the reader, I would avoid using a semicolon. And here we have another cautionary note. Do not use semicolons with conjunctions. Let's take a look at an example. Pac-Man likes cherries, semicolon, but Miss Pac-Man likes apples. Now here we don't use the word but. The semicolons and conjunctions perform similar functions. So that means using both is like hiring two people to do the same job. So let's go back to our good friend Princess Peach. Imagine if she called up Mario and asked him to lay some pipes in her new bathroom. Well, the problem there, he arrives, Luigi's already at work. And now you've brought in two people to do the same job and there's a conflict. So in this context, we don't use the but, we just use the semicolon. So again, do not use semicolons and conjunctions together. Now, that said, you can use semicolons with adverbs. That works a little differently. So for example, we might say, Pac-Man likes cherries, semicolon, however, comma, Miss Pac-Man prefers apples. So if you think that it's better to link two clauses together with a semicolon, but you might be concerned that the reader cannot infer the relationship, you could add the adverb, however, therefore, consequently, close it out with a comma, and then introduce the second clause. Now that we know how semicolons can link independent clauses, let's see how they can separate complex items. Before we go into the complex items, let's first make a list of simple items so that we can see the difference. There are 4 ghosts chasing Pac-Man, colon. Now here we have a colon, not the semicolon. We're using the colon to introduce a list. Blinky, comma, Pinky, comma, Inky, comma, and Clyde. Now, we're going to take that simple item and turn it into a list of complex items. We'll begin the same way. There are 4 ghosts chasing Pac-Man, colon. Blinky, comma, who is red. Now here we have a relative element that we're adding to Blinky so that the reader can differentiate which ghost is which based on their color. But we need a comma to introduce that element. And if we use a comma now to separate the items, the reader could get confused. So we instead use the semicolon. Pinky, comma, who is red, semicolon, new item. Pinky, comma, who is pink, semicolon. Inky, comma, who is cyan, semicolon, and Clyde, comma, who is orange. Now when you look at the full list, you can see we have 4 commas and 3 semicolons. And if we use the commas in each instance, the reader would quickly become confused as to which comma is doing what. And that's why we want to use the semicolons to separate complex items in a list. Now, should we capitalize after a semicolon? We talked about this with the colons, but the rules are actually different for the semicolon. Only capitalize proper names. Unlike the colon, you will only capitalize the first word after a semicolon if it is a proper name. Even if we have a complete sentence, an independent clause after the semicolon, we do not use a capitalization unless it is a proper name. All right, we're all done, so let's quickly summarize the difference between the colons and the semicolons and the functions that each of them performs. Let's start with the colons. All right, the element that precedes the colon must function as a complete sentence on its own. That's the #1 rule of Colon Club, right? So you have to have a complete sentence before the colon. Once you have that, though, the colon can then be used to introduce lists, conclusions, summations, and appositives. Again, the appositives are simply a renaming of something. And on a final note for the colons, if there's a proper name or independent clause after the colon, you will begin with a capital letter. However, if it's simply a list of common nouns after the colon, then you will only use lowercase. Now, with the semicolons, there are two functions. First, they can be used to link independent clauses, and they can be used to separate complex items in a list. But in addition to those two functions, we also have two key rules. Do not pair semicolons with conjunctions, and only capitalize proper names after the semicolon. Now, that is a quick rundown about the differences between colons and semicolons and the ways in which you can use each piece of punctuation effectively in your own writing. But if you have any questions about colons, semicolons, feel free to drop them in the chat box below and I'll do my very best to answer your question as quickly as possible. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.